Hi, everybody. It's so nice to see some familiar faces and names, and thank you all for joining us today. I want to introduce our illustrious panel, and we'll have them also share one word about arts education that describes their feeling about arts education. But before I get into that, let me just introduce each one of them in turn. Courtney D Clarke is the Interim Executive Director for ArtsWA Washington, and she's built her career performing on stage and teaching music in the classroom. Since joining Seattle Opera as school programs manager in 2018, she's led the curriculum development and growth of opera and multi-arts learning programs for students and teachers across Washington state. And as an opera singer, Courtney has performed in concerts and solo performances in the US and abroad. As a tenured chorus member of Nashville Opera, Courtney brings dedication and intentionality to create racial equity in arts education as she continues to strive to create a more socially just world through the lens of music and the practice of diversity, equity, and inclusion. Courtney, what's one word you would use to describe arts education? And I told you and the rest of the panelists, your word can be spoken, it could be sung, it could be visually presented either through a drawing or through a gesture, because I'm all about being multimodal.
Transformative.
Thank you. Thank you. Next up, we have Randy Engstrom, my neighbor from up the hill in Beacon Hill. And Randy's been a passionate advocate and organizer of cultural and community development for over 15 years. He's currently the director of the Office of Arts and Culture for the City of Seattle. As director of the office, he's expanded their investments in granting programs in public art while establishing new programs and policies for arts education, cultural space affordability, and racial equity. Most recently, he owned and operated Reflex Strategies, a cultural and community-based consulting business, and previously, he served as the founding director of the Youngstown Cultural Arts Center and the founding CEO of Static Factory Media. Lots of good stuff, Randy. What is your one word for arts education? Again, could be sung.
Oh, it's a beautiful. This is Nevaeh Hollis Ingstrom original, circa pandemic edition.
Nice. Thank you, Nevi, for your contributions to arts education. Next up, we have Tamar Krames. Tamar is a multimedia artist, an experienced educator and arts administrator, originally from the Bay Area. At ArtsWA, she is the Arts and Education Program Manager, and Tamar oversees a variety of programs and partnerships with a focus on equitable statewide access to culturally responsive arts learning. As a National Board Certified Educator and a practicing artist, Tamar supports courageous teaching and learning as the core of her work for the past 20 years. Tamar works alongside educators, artists, and communities to encourage and amplify the creative brilliance of youth. What is your one word for arts education, Tamar? Yay, thank you. Thank you. Thanks, panelists, for being up for my challenge to express your word in a variety of ways. To kick us off, Tamar, I'd love to ask you first, what policies have you seen come from federal, state, even city or district leadership this year? And how have these policies impacted arts education in the classroom or the community?
Better? Hi, everybody. It's nice to be here with you. Thank you, Carina. Sometimes my computer like does this little ghosty remute me thing that's really confusing to me. A couple things that I will say about that question, and it's a good question. It's really hard to talk about policy and arts and education from my viewpoint at the statewide view without talking about, the layered crises. I've looked at like, how do you say crisis in the plural and then the Uber plural and then the Uber plural, but just the layered crisis that we're all working with and responding to. So I want to talk a little bit about that and how that's changed what we do at the state level, and it's changed our relationship with some federal policy around arts funding and what we can and cannot do and at what speed we can and cannot do it. So I want to talk about layered crisis. I also want to talk briefly about this concept of trust, in particular, trusting educators, artists, youth, and families. And then I want to talk about a little bit about equity and some ways that I've seen that language and the implications of that language change in the work that I do. So just to start really quickly with this idea of crisis, when I think of crisis of this year and sort of the policy lag around responding to the needs of community, I'm thinking about layered crisis in terms of physical and mental health challenges, financial impact, COVID related, and just this moment in time on the globe and what that means for the sustainability and livelihood for all of us. And then also just the reckoning with system-wide and institutional racism and anti-Blackness and white supremacy that is sort of calling for change in policy and what we do. So, I would say what I have learned this year in relation to layered crisis is actually we can change things pretty quickly. So I've learned that at the federal level, even at the federal level, even at the state level, we can change things pretty quickly. And then on the other side of that is like, is it always good to change things really quickly? Because when you're working really quickly, sometimes you just replicate barriers. And so that's sort of both sides of the coin are like, yay, it turns out we can change things really quickly. And oh no, it turns out when you do things really quickly and you don't get the right people in the conversation, you just hit repeat and it comes out in a new form, the barriers and the inequities that are like rooted in policy. And I'm speaking about arts funding in particular. So that's one thing. The other thing is that changing things to meet community need this year in terms of funding and statewide programming in the arts has meant trusting educators, families, youth, artists in a new way, because things have to happen really quickly. So you're like, okay, like let's do this. We have to respond to this. And turns out like educators and artists and community-based organizations really know their work and the communities that they serve. And so that's why that idea of trust is in the front of mind for me right now in what we're doing at the state level. And then lastly, I'll just say I've seen some changes in the notions of equity in policy and arts and education, moving from sort of like wordsmithing and like language, like here's our DEI policy, to more action-oriented structures, which I see as a really positive shift. And I see that in the way that policy is handed to me. It's just a seed, but it's more action-oriented than it was a year ago, in my experience.
Tamar, can you give an example of what sort of action you've seen that has been a little bit more exciting instead of the chatter?
Yeah, I think there's just been more so how to say this, in like guidelines and grants and priorities that I see coming through the state, coming from federal level funding through state level funding, I feel like the notions of equity were like, what is your DEI plan? is more, I feel like, where I started, like what I saw coming across my field. And I feel like more and more, it's like, who is at the table with you from your community in the design of this whole thing? And what are you doing about that? Which is a real shift, I feel like, from just the two things. One, like, do you have a plan? And two, like, what is the data regarding who you are serving, but not like who is really at your table and what are you doing within your organization or your project to shift that. And that's really different to me than writing a DEI plan.
Courtney, I'm going to toss this one over to you. Maybe if you could address from your perspective at ArtsED Washington, what are some of the policies that you have seen, whether federal, state, or district level, and what are some stories from the field that you could share with us on the impacts of some of those policies?
Sure. I can piggyback off of a lot of what Tamar resonated, but I'm going to break it down like this: what the current policy is and has been, and why I feel my opinion matters. And currently, I mean, it is just what it is, and I hate to use that phrase, but just how the funding, the allocation of the dollars, how they are, just how it's based not on the needs of the students. That stands out more than anything to me. I do not feel that the policy is meeting the needs of our students, which education should be doing. It should be meeting the needs of the students. And that is a direct inequity right there, when your funding is based on property value in a chronic homelessness, displaced. I mean, that's a whole nother topic, and I'm not going to go there, but to narrow it down, just looking at that and how the embarrassment of just being 46 out of 50 states funding, education funding in one of the top richest states, wealthiest states. I mean, I agree that we have I see more, to get to it, I've seen more gains happening on the state level when it comes to our equity and diversity and inclusion happening in our strategic plans with our public school systems, trying to incorporate a more sense of inclusiveness. But the policy, it's just an uneven playing field when you have $4.5 million in PTA funds and you've got, no funding happening in depending on a property value in certain areas of our state. Until that system kind of changes, until we see some of those systematic changes in the policy on the federal level, that is some of the things that we are getting, the feedback that we're getting, that it's not fair, that we're not getting accessible and equitable education, arts education, because of the way the policy is designed. if that makes any
Yeah.
sense.
Yeah, no, it sounds
Because of those
fundamental.
statistics.
Right. Right.
I mean, it's insane. But it's written that way. It's designed that way. And you cannot reach every child. If I was a child in my demographic right now, I would not be receiving an equitable and accessible education right now in my area. And it's disheartening. But I have to say, depending on the school district, you know, Seattle Public Schools and that strategic plan, especially in English language arts, and making sure that we're reaching our most vulnerable communities, and reading that equity and inclusion language is something.
Mm-hmm. Thank you for that, Courtney. Randy, I'm going to switch over to you. Could you talk a little bit more about, like, piggybacking off of what Courtney said with just the fundamental inequity of how education is funded? What are some of the things that you've seen that Seattle, through your office and also Seattle Public Schools partnership through Creative Advantage, what are the ways that that you've been mitigating that fundamental inequity in access, and how have those types of policies or actions shifted since the pandemic?
Thanks, Carina, and thanks to my fellow panelists. I don't think I can underscore enough what was just said about systems. Systems don't just happen, systems are designed. And systems are a series of intentional choices made by authorizing environments. And while COVID did not create the disparate outcomes that students of color face, did not create white supremacy culture or institutional racism, it certainly acted as an accelerant. And it certainly laid bare all the places where our institutional models have come up short by design. That said, one of the things I love and respect about the work I've been privileged to do with Creative Advantage, with Seattle Public Schools, with Seattle Art Museum, with ArtsWA, with ArtsEd Washington, over these many years, is to really advocate for racially equitable systemic change and to center the needs of the students farthest from educational justice in making those changes. Creative Advantage is a plan that was written by 2,000 people over the span of a year and a half, based on really rigorous data and assessment, which showed us, perhaps not surprisingly, that you can predict student access to arts education in Seattle Public Schools by race, family income, and home language. Like basically everything else in our society, your zip code, your home address, and how you grew up dictates your access to both public and private opportunity. You know, and I think, you know, had the pandemic not hit this year, we were on track to actually reach every school in Seattle Public Schools by 2020, which by some miracle was the goal that we had when we launched in 2013, when the plan was finally written. And I think that, you know, that it was not a straight line. It was a circuitous journey. And so much credit goes to Carrie Campbell, Lara Davis, Gail Selhorst, Audrey Kearns, Ashraf Hasham. There were a ton of people who carried, lifted up, sometimes put on their back this partnership, and had to pivot because it turns out every school community is different, every learning community is different, every student is different. And so while you're trying to make structural change, you still have to be able to meet the needs of individual people and meet them where they are and meet them on their own terms. And that also is not how systems are designed by and large. But when I think about this community, I think about March 9th. And that was the day that Ijeoma Oluo launched the Seattle Artist Relief Fund. That was before the governor's first stay-home order. Ijeoma's first instinct as a brilliant artist of color, luminary, civic leader, she set up an artist relief fund, not for herself, but to help everyone else, to help folks like her brother Ijeoma, or her brother Aham, who is, you know, essentially anyone who made their living gigging and playing music, or depending on the assembly of human beings in a space, was legislated out of work immediately. And that was 9 months ago. But I couldn't be more proud of the fact that the Artist Relief Fund was established even before the governor stepped in, even before the institutions caught up. An artist thought, I'm going to help out other artists. The Office of Arts and Culture established the first Artist Relief Fund in America, not through an application process, by emailing everyone we fund and saying, we're giving you more money. Just tell us what you're going to spend it on. Well, I think that instinct, no barriers, no bullshit, just how can we help you? And how can we not let these institutional practices that actually can cause more harm do that? How do we not replicate that? I think that point about not recreating inequity was really important, that got lifted up earlier by Tamar, because I think I actually experienced the reverse of the like wordsmithing to action. I think the city did a great job from like March through May. And then George Floyd got murdered and there was this reckoning. And then we went into like spin doctor land and I think that the words got ahead of the actions. And you know, it's complicated. Governance is complicated. Institutional change is complicated. When we were firefighting a global pandemic in real time, I think we defaulted to the values that we know and we did a good job. I think when we started trying to politic it backslid a bit, which is neither here nor there for the sake of arts education and creative advantage. But you know, I think that of all the things I've seen during the pandemic, the pivot that Creative Advantage made, the district and our staff of, you know, it's April, no one knows what the plan is, but Ashraf and Tina and Gail and Audrey were like, we're gonna pivot, we're gonna hire 30 teaching artists off of our roster, they're gonna create 3 10-minute lessons plans, we're gonna stream them on YouTube, on SPS TV, on Seattle channel, anywhere we can, so that people like me who are learning how to homeschool kids, it's going okay, she can paint a heart now, but for people who are homeschooling their kids to have that opportunity, those teaching artists and that partnership was ahead of the institution. The creative community led the way. And while we are staring down what is arguably an extinction event for the nonprofit experiment in this country, for the nonprofit cultural community, I've never seen more resilience and innovation coming from the artists and creatives themselves. And there's no better evidence of that than the pivot that Creative Advantage made in April going online. And that is due not only to the brilliance of the team of Ashraf and Tina and Gail and Audrey, but also to the artists. And all of those artists being able, in the face of pretty impossible economic realities, to be like, no, we're gonna bring it. And the first time I saw that trailer, they showed it in a staff meeting, I was literally brought to tears because I couldn't believe that that kind of resilience was even possible when the cards felt like they were down as hard as they were. So that was a very long answer to your question, but those are, I mean, that's, I'm resonating a lot with what the other panelists said. I think we all feel it. I think we all know where we are in this moment, in this country, in this time. And while it's scary as hell, there's also just incredible, I have incredible hopefulness about it, which seems counterintuitive, but I do.
I'll hang on to that hope, Randy. I'll take it with me. Tamar, Randy gave some great examples of artists in the local area really leading the charge and being as creative as artists are, like coming up with solutions, problem solving, trying things out. What have you seen in other parts of the state that that also show that creative resilience, whether it's in the classroom or in the community?
Yeah, it's, let's see, how can I frame this? So at the Arts Commission, at the Washington State Arts Commission, ArtsWA, we have really started to think regionally in everything we do, so that we don't highlight sort of the I-5 corridor as where all the creative work of the state is happening. And we have been taking just like a ton of intentional moves in partnership with a lot of different folks to sort of shift that narrative for our state in terms of who are our artists and arts educators, and like what do they look like and talk like, and what are so that has looked a few different ways. So for those of you who are unfamiliar with ArtsWA's, it's kind of a new regional distribution of our programming. We've split, it's so random, but we split the state into 4 different regions, the Northwest, the Southwest, the Central, and the Eastern region. And we're really trying to build visibility and celebrate the leadership in the arts in general, arts and culture, but also in arts and education in each of the regions. So a couple things I've seen in terms of resilience and creative problem solving, for sure. There's been there's been a lot of very beautiful leadership that have come from tribal communities across the state of Washington, and who have reached out to arts organizations to be like, resilience is like what we do, and reaching out to is what we do, and bringing community members into the center of our schooling is what we do. So I feel like there's been a shift from sort of outreach to tribal and Native communities in terms of like, we must diversify our participants, to really like help us better understand how to do this work in crisis, and do this work around like creative resilience and intergenerational collaboration in the arts and culture. And so that's been a really cool outcome. And I see that in a lot of different programs that we are a part of. So 2 things: 1, tribal communities and Indigenous leadership in arts and culture and education, and 2, also dual language communities, I would say in the same way, have so much to teach the whole state around what it means to, I guess, decenter the status quo in how we communicate about the arts and culture, and who we invite into that sort of realm of expertise. So that's where the most learning, like beautiful learning, has come for me, is working with dual language communities and, or I should say multilingual communities and Indigenous communities.
Thank you. Courtney, how about you and your statewide work for arts educators? What are you hearing from classroom teachers and also community teaching artists? How have they had to reinvent their creative practice and their teaching practice?
Well, gosh, I have spoken to so many educators in the past 9 months, and I have been looking at this time as a sense of a rebirth. I can't wait to see all of the wonderful creation that comes out of this COVID period. And with that to say, music, music education alone. My specialty is in music. I remember when I decided to go back and get my second licensure. And there was a section in my intro to music education. It was a text. It was a huge, boring textbook. And there was a section in there about teaching on the platform of music technology. And it was, an entire chapter of now. Classroom teachers had a choice, though. You can use your curriculum in hand, or you could actually upgrade your classroom and be completely digital, redigitalize your entire classroom. And you had many tenured educators who did not want to think outside of the box. They did not want to challenge themselves. And to make that long story short is, we were all forced to have to go virtual. And it kind of ties in to so much. I had a beautiful opportunity to be on a team called the Statewide Arts Educators Advisory Team. And it was just a collective group of educators across the state of Washington State. And they created, along with myself, the Arts Are Essential. And the one wonderful thing about this is we wanted to create a document that showed that this is how the arts can survive during COVID, that they can exist. And teachers were resilient. They became very creative. They figured out how, the game of how to sing and how to create breakout rooms with practice rooms, how to check in on their students, how to meet at the park and practice their instruments. Kids were having COVID pod practice sections. But then there was so much more that did not involve the transmission of breath and practicing theory or the creation of arts integration with incorporating reprogramming or incorporating music theory and writing. So there were so many wonderful conversations of incorporating literacy, or how, since I have been pulled out of my arts practice, and now I am now a English language arts teacher so that I can continue to work. How can I integrate the arts? How can I teach through the lens of, which is a specialty of mine, because I was that classroom educator, that music teacher that had to teach 600 kids a week, but I also had to teach literacy and numeracy across the board. So they still wanted to be able to practice their art form, even though, because of COVID, they were now the history teacher or the science teacher. And there is a way to do it and be happy. And so out of this time, so much newness and so much creativity, and using the arts as a tool of enrichment has been very innovative. And every week I talk to a new teacher that has created something new or has a new idea. And it's all just hands-on. Every week there's something new that they've tried differently. And that's why I say this is an era, this is a time of rebirth. It's kind of like the COVID renaissance,
Yeah. I think what's been interesting to see is certainly that creative resilience and people really switching into problem-solving mode and trying all these things out. I do want to say though, and I want to ask all our panelists if you'd like to respond. The longer we go in this mode, now we're at however many months, 9 months we're in, there's definitely some fatigue. The pressure has been unrelenting to arts educators. What are some of the supports that either people in the field have been asking for, or that within your either at ArtsWA or at the city level, or things that you've heard at the district level? What are the supports that are out there for arts educators?
Well, I can say I have a couple of school districts, their leadership have contacted me since I have been in the interim executive position. And COVID took, they were really looking forward to enrichment and kind of a standards, just a separate time for their arts educators to just have a time away from, just an enrichment standards workshop, kind of an encouragement, a morale boosting time, so that they can feel just as included and really confident about the work that they do and how to connect that arts integration. It was all thrown out of the door, and they immediately had to go right into COVID procedures. And, they are now looking at the calendar for the spring, and they're saying, hey, is there a way that we can maybe come in and have some motivational time with our arts educators, maybe a standard-based workshop, and some, maybe a few hours, whether it's virtual or live. So that's one thing I know that Arts Ed Washington is receiving.
Great. Thank you. Tamar, Randy, how about you all? What are the supports that you're hearing that are needed, and what are the ones your specific agencies have been providing? Thanks, Scott, for sharing that resource in the chat, by the way.
Yeah, I'll start. I spent most of the morning in the U.S. Cultural Policy Forum, where this, so starting national, like what are the opportunities at the federal level from executive action, legislative action, to moving resources and being able to create opportunity. There's a whole section. One of the 6 priorities is around arts education. So, direct investment, Title I, additional professional development, partnership with other agencies, trauma informed practice. A lot of the stuff that the Creative Advantage has taught me about in terms of what makes good teachers and teaching artists. A lot of the PD that's been offered through this partnership is a lot of what is explored federally at a scale. So the second part of that is, how do you move the resources from federal, state to local? And we've been in a lot of conversations about a modern day WPA, Works Progress Administration, where you hire artists and teaching artists at scale to do a lot of that work. Also a version of it in the 70s called CETA that spent $12 billion at one point on hiring artists to direct intervention in their community. And we've been developing a local version in Seattle that we're calling Hope Corps. One of the 6 areas of focus is arts education. And the concept is that we raise ideally about $2 million, and we hire hundreds of teaching artists, in this case, to provide whatever form of intervention they can. They can be partnered with schools through something as formal as Creative Advantage. They can be doing out of school time support. And to me, the opportunity to invest in teaching artists who are incredible communicators, incredibly adaptive and resilient, and super creative in how they do their work, has the added benefit of meeting the most vulnerable population we have right now, which is kids who are disconnected from the learning environment. So any investment we can make at any level of government, to me, feels like an incredibly strategic and responsible act. But Ashraf and I were in a meeting with Seattle Foundation I think it was yesterday, to talk about like what could it look like to approach some of their fund holders, their donor advised fund holders, who are passionate about social emotional development and young people and digital divide, but haven't yet identified an intervention to invest in. If we could take that intervention and put that into hundreds of teaching artist contracts so that they can do a whole bunch of different approaches of reaching young people. The challenge is that there's no roadmap for this, and that fatigue you referenced, Carina, nobody had a plan to get through 18 months of this. There's not a small business on earth that has a plan to be closed for 18 months. Large, small, nonprofit, for-profit. So, we are all flying without a map. But I trust that if we could put the money in the hands of those teaching artists, of those creative workers, that they will figure out. And we built it as a cohort model, so they're not doing it alone. See the trust, Tamar. But can they be a community of practice? Can they be a learning community to have each other to co-design the interventions that can meet the kids with the highest need and can be the most creative about adapting their work to meet the unique challenges of the moment? So it's modeled off of the pivots that Creative Advantage has been making. My challenge is, how do we go get more money? And so there's some of that money that we can get philanthropically or through the private sector locally. I think it was brought up earlier that we live in one of the wealthiest places on the planet. The largest foundation on Earth is across the street from the Space Needle in the Gates Foundation. We have the money. We don't choose to spend the money in the ways that maybe would benefit the most people. Setting that aside, I think there's work to be done with our philanthropic community. And then I think there's work to be done upstream to get that federal money, because I think it will come at some point. There was signs of life today at the federal level, not as much as we need, but something. And so, I think that is the puzzle. And I think that's where a lot of my attention has been lately, is how do we not just find that money at the federal level, but figure out how it gets downstream to folks on the ground and community.
Tamar, do you want to add anything to that in terms of?
Boy, I feel like I could talk for about a year about just what is happening from my particular view at ArtsWA in terms of statewide and our relation to state money that has come from both the NEA and also Federal CARES Act funds that have come through our office, and what we are learning and what we're up to. In many ways, I don't know where to begin to keep that sort of brief in terms of what our priorities are, but I'll say just a couple things to your question, and then maybe I'll circle back around if there's more questions about it. I'll start by saying that the Washington State Arts Commission is really teeny tiny, in case you didn't know that. And our arts and education department, our grant department, it's like a few of us, literally, doing like a bazillion different things. And we are not set up to do like massive distribution of funds, which is interesting because we're statewide, right? So in many ways, it's like off scale in many ways to what we're seeing happening in King County. However, that said, there's a lot of things that we have heard and we know people need. By people, I mean arts organizations, artists, school, out of school, in school partnerships, all kinds of partnerships between youth organizations or organizations that serve youth and schools and schooling. The biggest requests and needs have been moving from funding that's project related to funding that supports operational support and just keeping people employed and keeping the lights on. And so that's probably the most profound and quick work that we're doing with NEA and like federal money and state money, is how much of that can we take out of what we usually require from folks in terms of data collection and final reports and budget building and all of that stuff, to just say, you need money, here's the money. So we have made a lot of changes, in many ways also faster than, like, we made them before we had all our questions answered. Does that make sense? We just made them. And much of the country is doing that, right? Like, can we just like change the contracts to operating support? Let's change them. And so hopefully that works. And it has worked. So most of our grants have been changed from really heavily oriented towards specific projects with a lot of specific requirements to like, let's get you your money, get this money to you as quickly as we can. CARES funding has been constant. That flow of money through ArtsWA has been pretty unpredictable and quick, and we have had to absorb and figure out how to do that in partnerships with agencies we never worked with before, and their requirements and data collection and final reports. And so there's just been a tremendous amount of learning, but I do think it will continue. That funds will come through, at least ArtsWA's sort of revolving door of funds. And I do think there'll be less, more access in the application process, and quicker turnaround and fewer requirements in the final report and data collection requirements, so that people are not burdened by like having to hire a grant writer to access funds. Yeah, and the other thing I'll say, just in terms of what in our programming, what people need, seems really consistent that teaching artists, arts organizations, many that we partner with want to dig into concepts of anti-racist teaching, concepts of dismantling white supremacy in their organizational efforts and in their partnerships, and what that even means. And that has been statewide. I see that there's a lot of interest in training and refining and growing in that area. And also trauma-informed practices and working with families and youth right now, and how to support each other as educators. And then the last thing I'll say that we are doing at ArtsWA and really thinking about, and I know that Creative Advantage is doing a lot of this work too, is how to say this, how to teach as educators specifically, how to engage with virtual teaching and all of what we're learning that are digital tools, all the access points and barriers that we're learning about, how to engage with those new platforms of engaging with communities in ways that are inspiring and feel authentic to the teachers themselves, so that the teachers are showing up and are able to really be spontaneous and find their storytelling and find their joy in this new way of teaching, which I have heard a lot of educators just really wanting to get past the like must-do list of access and tools, and just wanting to find the joy with teaching. So that's a lot of our programming is focused on gathering educators and just giving and receiving permission to find the magic and joy and the relational space of teaching and learning through and beyond this kind of weird, exhausting COVID screen reality that hurts our eyes and brains and all of our cells.
Well, and I think, thanks for that, Tamar. I think I keyed in on relational, because really that's, if we're, education is about relationships, and whether that's happening in person or through the mediation of a screen, like how do we keep those relationships alive through all of this, through changes in platform and all of that. And I think the biggest gift that students need right now is to be able to connect with a caring, consistent adult and with their peers. I wanted to, Regan informed me that there weren't any questions put forward in the chat, so I'm just going to go ahead and toss out one last round, give you each an opportunity to respond. And I think the question that I'd like you to respond to is, what's one person, project, or idea connected to arts education that you want to shine a light on right now? It could be something happening locally or nationally, but what's one thing that you want to shine a light on right now? And Randy, I'll go to you first.
Well, one is I just keep thinking about the video for the Creative Advantage online, and Erica Merritt is singing like a cappella. That's like the audio bed of the trailer, and so that song plays a lot in my head as I think about how we're gonna get out of this. And I also my little home office stares across Beacon Avenue at the Feed the People Plaza mural on Beacon Hill. And I think about Chef Tarek, who both does his teaching at Coyote, teaching young people to cook, also created this community mural with 47 different artists, including my daughter. And I use both of those examples as like, people just did it. People didn't wait for permission. They just like made this shift and they followed their heart and they leaned into their craft and people responded. And I feel like when the cards are down, that's like all we have. And I've had this weird journey this year of like, you know, being a co-pilot of the city's relief and recovery efforts from COVID, not the arts, like the whole city. And no one knows what to do. No, there is no like master plan. Other people that make more money and run bigger agencies than mine do not have a better idea of what to do than Chef Tarek or Erica Merritt or the teaching artists that I am privileged to work with and the staff that I get to work with. It is our creative community that's going to get us out of this. I honestly believe that. And I actually think I have like tangible proof of that assumption over the last 9 months.
Courtney, how about you? What's one thing that one person, one project that you want to shine a light on?
Unmute. I'm really excited about Arts at Washington's collaborative project, Stay Inside the Lines, our coloring book that is already have books going out for Christmas. They will, I mean, we've got like orders going out featuring some of our BIPOC community graffiti artists around the city for our Title I funding. So for every one book that is sold, a Title I school will get 2 books. So I'm just really proud of that project. And of course, some of the artists, all of the artists that contributed their art, and just the change, the systematic change, and the fun that it will bring to arts education. That is just a sweet project, and I'm looking forward to a coloring book myself. It's just,
Courtney, would you mind dropping a link to that in the
I sure will. I was actually trying to do it, but then it started talking, and they premiered it on Channel 5, I think, and I just deleted I just got out of it because I was like, oh my God, I'm ruining everything. But I will drop that.
Okay, thanks. Tamar, how about you? One thing you want to shine a light on?
I really want to shine a light on early educators and care providers to Washington's youngest learners, and that includes grandparents and aunties and stay-at-home parents and cousins and older siblings and early learning educators and teaching artists that work with these young ones that I just have the privilege. When I entered this role with ArtsWA, we were launching an early learning program. And I'm just gonna say, as an educator, and for many years an educator of educators, and I taught high school for most of my career, mostly worked with secondary teachers and students. I did not have to unpack my devaluing of education with early learning until I had this like early learning project, and I saw everywhere I looked, there was like this consistent devaluing of the work of early learning educators and care providers for young learners. And it's just been astounding to me how sort of persistently deprofessionalized that kind of teaching, not just caregiving and cleaning, but brilliant, creative. If ever were there a place where there was arts integration, it is there. And I have been so moved by it. And I just want to elevate that work. And this year I've had the privilege to work with 8 different early learning communities that have taken on, even in COVID, arts integration as the model for their school. Some tribal other communities that are taking that on in early learning settings. And these educators don't identify as artists or teaching artists. They are early learning educators, but I cannot emphasize enough how much they are singing to teach math, how much they are dancing to teach science. Like, it is phenomenal and so undervalued in the world when we think about education reform and when we think about, you know, sort of like the posters of like anti-racist education. Like, they're just so rarely, we so rarely think to learn from them. And I would love to see that change. And I just have learned so much. It brings me to tears. They've been like first responders in terms of childcare. I mean, they've literally been first responders to provide childcare for first responders. And so many of them, when other school communities were closed, like, there are still these little ones hanging out with educators. And it's just been a huge learning curve for me, really humbling, where I'm like, man, I thought my work was hard. Like, dang, these people. Yep, that's all I'll say about that. I wish I could share like some of the things they're doing with their families and with the youth in their communities, but some other time.
Well, thank you. Thanks for shining a light on all those aspects of arts education that that we both want to celebrate and also pay attention to as we continue to move forward to a new administration. Looking forward to January, folks. So thank you all for being here, for joining us.